want to introduce you real quick. I'm gonna go full professional on you. I'm gonna apologize. So Travis Palmer is a red team engineer at the Intercontinental Exchange and is certified OSCP and OSCE. He's certified OSCP and OSCE. Most recently, he has been a surprise backup speaker at DEF CON 27, the Red Team Village staff, and a speaker at Wild West Hackin Fest and Cisco Offensive Security Summit. He is a fan and sometimes a contributor of a number of simulator/sandbox video games and keeper of too many unfinished hardware projects. That's actually awesome. May I ask, like, what sandbox simulator video games?
I spend too much of my time in Arma 3, so.
Oh yeah. Damn. That's a
waiting forever for Bohemia to maybe, I don't know, use a new engine and make a new game out of it. That'd be neat.
I tried to get into that so hard, but I think you also need like a group of friends.
It's more of a learning cliff, but once you're over it, it's not too bad.
Okay. It looks super fun. I have to try to get into that a lot more.
Keep mines in Emacs. That's a fact.
For real? Oh damn. Okay.
You don't need all of them though, but kind of like Emacs.
Wow. Okay. Awesome. So I think Travis is going to be talking about password cracking beyond 15 characters and under $500. And we now, if we want to be precise about this, we got 20 seconds. So how about a quick quiet moment. 20 seconds.
Ask me presenter in the meanwhile, I think.
Yeah, quick quiet moment. You can be presenter. Silence. Amazing.
All right. So this is cracking under 15 characters for cracking beyond 15 characters for under $500. Other titles for this talk were Greener Pastures Over the Computational Wall, or the one my management proposed, Why XKCD Advice is Easy to Understand and Hard to Do. We'll learn about why that was pretty soon enough. I'm a nerd. I go by the pseudonym Travco. For those who missed the track 1 conversation yesterday about rebranding the image of a hacker, I am unfortunately a young male in a hoodie perpetually in a somewhat dimly lit room who listens to electronica while literally hacking Wall Street. Intercontinental Exchange operates and owns the New York Stock Exchange. But I'm all for the computer wizard rebranding as soon as we can get that going. I am an OSCP, OSCE, and GMOB, if those letters mean something to you. I help run the Red Team Village at DEF CON, specifically the Exploit Development Station. And on the topic of questionable decisions, someone let me speak at Wild West Hackin Fest again this year, and my management chain also approved this talk. More on that later. As is tradition for speakers, a couple of my favorite hobbies are outside of security are on the right, D&D, Arma 3, and BWC. Yes, I am a nerd. And I've committed the cardinal sin of putting too much on some of these slides, so this is the point where I'm going to ditch my ugly mug and let it go full screen because some of these are going to be pretty tightly packed. For this talk, we're going to start with a fair bit of background before we get into the meat of things. I should give a disclaimer. This isn't going to be an all-inclusive introductory talk. There's kind of too much to get through here. So if you've never heard of Hashcat before and are thinking, where can I adopt one? This talk is going to be a little rough to follow. I'm going to be going into the weeds and back out into concepts throughout the talk. So if you are one of those people that are thinking about adopting a Hashcat, just stick around. You'll still learn something and you'll definitely have some keywords to Google later. So let's address the first question that should always be asked, why? Large web corporations are still using character requirements that were determined in 1985 by the Department of Defense to be resistant to online brute force attacks over a 1,200 baud modem. And even then, they should have been rotated every couple of months. This is part of the reason why I need to apologize to Daren, because I get to reiterate a bunch of things that they gave an hour-long spiel on. They also have complexity requirements that should seem familiar because they've become pervasive and are largely responsible for a lot of people honestly believing they can take almost any English word and add a number and an exclamation point on the end and make it an acceptable password. Spoiler, these policies in isolation have not magically become more secure since 1985 and are still guarding very sensitive things. Thankfully, most of these websites and companies have some additional safety nets like detecting questionable login origins or 2FA, well, except Wikipedia, which, well, doesn't, and historically might have had one of the worst password policies on the internet. Thank you, Troy Hunt, for using a megaphone to broadcast history here, which why? Your fix for 0-character passwords was a 1-character requirement? There's also a large number of places where that 8-character standard, well, isn't, which frankly is a little baffling given some of the sensitivity here. PCI, or the payment card industry, which really only covers the systems where payment card info is stored or the adjacent systems, it's just a little lackluster. On the other side of this, imagine the kind of information someone could get by getting into your Facebook or Pornhub account. Imagine what they could do to your reputation by controlling it. Then there's eBay. I shouldn't need to explain the level of financial ruin an auction site can bring if someone else is bidding for you. Wells Fargo, deserving punching bag perhaps, but they really haven't wisened up. That's a 14-character limit. Is there seriously a database with plain text credentials limited to 14 characters in the back end somewhere? And there's Netflix. Should probably make sense now why hijack Netflix accounts are so commonplace. I understand the want to make 4-number pins usable, but really? Finally, we have a whole suite of devices set by the people installing it, but, you know, I'll pick on Cisco because I love them so much. By default, they have no password. The policy might get set by the people installing it, but they're only going to suggest 8 characters. That seems like a deeply questionable recommendation when, again, these passwords are determined only to be resistant to attacks on networks in 1985. And while I'm on the trend of bashing trustworthy sources, it's only proper that I talk about NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, and what they say, given that what they say often seeps into government regulation. Special Publication 800-63B, released in 2017, said the requirement should be 8+ characters with no complexity because someone did the statistical analysis and found out that people actually produce easier to brute force passwords under complexity requirements. Like adding a number and an exclamation point. They also say the maximum length should at least be 64 characters. A hint of where things might be going. There's also this key section here that says, increased password length is a key security control and to encourage passphrases. You hear that. The future is coming slowly and the late 80s might finally end soon. The most recent guidance on February of this year, mind you, not the first time it was published, from NIST and the FBI is more explicit on this. 15 characters without other complexity requirements is where we should be going, and in fact, we should require it as soon as possible. And this is in line with what a bunch of other experts and sources that aren't the largest tech companies have been saying for much, much longer. In fact, a security consulting group that I greatly respect, Black Hills Information Security, makes the suggestion to their clients and uses a much more paranoid standard of 20 characters internally. Neat. Though you might be asking, okay, why is Black Hills specifically on here? Well, it's because in the spirit of this conference, I'm picking on them. And we're about to listen to some snippets of audio from a webcast last December with Daren and CJ.
7 characters is just easy to crack. How easy? If you go to the next slide, my son's computer, he's got a gaming computer. It takes 8 minutes to crack an LM hash. If you take the same 14-character password, it would take 4.3 billion years.
Oh, we got time.
This is kind of what I'm talking about with regards to the password policy that they set in 1985. I mean, in 1985, an 8-character password policy was secure forever. Because, or, you know,
it's 90 days.
90 days, okay. So it was secure for long enough for them to we don't need to do anything. But, I mean, as technology changes, so do the password policies need to.
Hey, this is warfare, right? Everything is move, counter move. We have electronic countermeasures. You have electronic countermeasures. Then it goes up above that, and I lose track. So
we're getting questions about have you run the Google Common Word attack against passphrases? So, like, if you just load words into a cracker, doesn't that crack passphrases?
Sure. Yes, it does. How many combinations of 4-word passwords are there? So how long is that going to take you? What if you start using words from a foreign dictionary? What if you start putting salt into those words? But I think if four words, and if you start using special characters as a spacer between your words and things like this, the question is, are you more secure than you were with 8? Yes, there are attacks against everything. So Daren kind of summarized this from the field, kind of our results, but I just did want to talk about it. We have no success with people who have 15-character passwords, approaches 0. And we have tried these things. Now we're constrained in our time. Normally, we don't have more than a week or so to do our password guessing. Whereas attacker, according to Verizon report, they've got 9 months, something like that.
This question's come up a few times. Are spaces legal?
Yes, they are a special character, and they are very good.
And that's where I'm going to end it. They have a bunch of pointed recommendations, and they are solid. I am picking out, obviously, only the parts that I take issue with. But the most interesting thing they mentioned there is that they've been given hashes from a domain with a 15-character passphrase policy specifically to crack them. And the amount that they can crack within a week approaches 0, basically no success. Hack it in, presentation over. That's all, folks. No? You're not buying that? Well, good, because neither am I, and I should address the final reason I'm here presenting on this topic in particular.
But so getting on the password policy, so taking that innovative kind of incubator mindset and looking at passwords. So passwords are something that's highly audited because it's very easy to do. If you're an auditor and you're trying to assess whether somebody's passing muster, you can have this rule set and you can walk in and either they pass or they fail. And you'll see a lot of that, and a lot of the companies have this password policy that comes straight out of audits. 8 characters, 3 or 4 of uppercase, lowercase, special characters and numbers. I just rattle it off. It's been almost 20 years of that. So we looked at that, though, and as we went through the red teaming, we found that one step in what we call the kill chain, if a attacker were successful, and we actually give them a leg up, we actually bring hackers on and bring them in as fake employees. We give them a laptop and a password, and they start. And we found one step in the kill chain was taking all the passwords and cracking them. And they would run computers with graphic processing unit, augmentation, and they'd run for hours, and they'd be able to crack a few passwords, and hopefully they'd find a privileged account, and then they were off to the races with that. So while that was only one step in what I call the kill chain, we just said, we want to win that battle. And here we are compliant, but it's just not getting it done, just meeting compliance. So we ran some math on the whiteboard, and we said, well, what if we went out to a really long password, 15 characters, but got rid of all the complexity requirements? And I have a lot of people with high math SAT scores in my team. Let's put it that way. So we had some great whiteboard battles, and how much better would it be, and that sort of thing. But what kept creeping in there, because of kind of that tick box mentality, was, well, we have to have complexity. Everybody's expecting that. We have to have uppercase and lowercase and on and on. But we said, well, let's just try it out. So the math held, and we felt pretty good about it. And then around that time, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, released an updated standard. And they said, well, length is king. And if you can get a longer password, you can get rid of some of that stuff as long as you look for commonly used passwords and block them out. So long story short, we did it. And it took about 90 days to roll it in. And the impact has been substantial. And the only reason we were able to do that is because we innovated and created this thing that we called the Kraken, that every single day tries to crack all the passwords in the company. And we see the success rate of that machine just dropping precipitously.
That's where I'm going to cut that. That's all out in the public domain now. Thanks, Jerry. And we also really ought to talk about that math that Jerry mentioned. The math might hold up, but the equation isn't realistic. There's more than one way of approaching this problem, and I've heard the argument spun multiple different ways, the first of which is that it's inconceivable to crack a 15-character password because brute forcing through all the possible numbers and lowercase letters is 1.6 sextillion combinations. Another argument I've heard that comes from a better standpoint is assuming a passphrase is made up of words. There are a lot of words around 5 characters or more, so you can say 15-character passphrase is probably 3 words, which is extremely difficult. You'd have to go through more than 50 quadrillion options to be sure. Okay, big number, but certainly smaller than the last one. And the last one I heard, perhaps the most educated of these straw man arguments, is based on the common requirement of 8 characters. Doubling that gets you just above the 15-character requirement. So maybe we should just think about passphrases as just multiple passwords combined, in which case the lowest margin we have here for cracking is trying all the combinations of 2 common passwords combined, which, if we're using the RockU dictionary, is still well over 205 trillion. Which they'll say is unreasonable. Well, I'm here to tell you that all of these arguments that say cracking past 15 characters, regardless of reasoning, can be undermined, and they can be undermined in only 3 factors. What are those 3 factors, you might ask? Are you just teasing us? Is this a timeshare scheme in disguise? No, the big secret weakness is humans. Inconceivable! I know. Specifically, humans are bad at big numbers. Humans pack complexity on the ends of passwords and passphrases, and humans pack similar things to other humans. Common things are common because they're commonly picked. Now, before I get too far, we should define some limits to what is reasonable, and I should address the other part of the clickbaity title for this talk. Why the $500 limit? Well, besides it being a nice round number that you can easily pitch to management, it's also the roundabout cost of an entertainment system, and you can safely assume that every type of threat actor you need to be worried about, including LulzSec and the script kiddies, has access to this kind of money. It's also the amount that can pack a sizable punch regardless of the path you take, either owning a cracking rig or renting out cloud computing. $500 is more than enough to go off and build a small cracking system out of a GPU from eBay and some outdated desktop, and should net you a theoretical max hash rate of 53 gigahashes against an TLM thereabouts. And as for the cloud, In AWS, $500 gives you 68 hours on spot instances, which might get preempted, probably won't though, with 8 V100 GPUs, which you can do manually, or you can use management tools like Coalfire's NPK to manage the spot instances for you and both scale and automate the attack. If you are an attacker and what you're planning on doing is a series of short-running attacks, instead of waiting 68 hours for get all the results, why not just automate spinning up 68 instances and get the results in one? Sadly, NPK doesn't work on Google Cloud, which appears to be cheaper, and you can actually squeeze out 83 hours of time on an instance with 8 V100 GPUs, which, besides being terrifically cheap, brings us to a terrifying theoretical maximum of 189.3 petahashes of NTLM we can guess. Not mega, not giga, not tera, peta, 189 quadrillion. And if we compare that to the last strawman argument of RockU dictionary on top of itself, sure, theoretical isn't real performance, but the difference usually isn't off by a factor of 1,000 times, although humans are bad with big numbers. Which brings us around to the second strawman argument, and I'd like to throw in an alternative equation that is still very conservative for how many guesses it takes to crack a 3-word passphrase. All of the words that aren't obsolete to the third power divided by the number of people in the organization you care about, or the number of hashes the attacker has to crack, all of which is divided by the factor of human laziness squared. How do you quantify human laziness? Don't ask me, but trust me, the value of that variable is always greater than 1. The very conservative hypothesis here behind the joke is that people making a passphrase will use words from languages they know and can think of under the duress of password creation, which tends to be a much more limited set. In fact, I'm going to say now and support later that pool to pick for a lot of people seems to be between 32,000 and 64,000 words, which brings me to the point where we need to break out a lot of math, because underminer number 1, people are bad at big numbers. Thankfully, people are good at spotting trends after they have all the information. So let me give you something that's hopefully easier to parse. And yeah, this is why my face is not up right now, so we can do full screen slides. This is a chart of the actual computational limits of combining words together in attack for a single 2080 Ti on NTLM hashes, which I picked because it's a consumer GPU and I have access to one. The horizontal axis of this chart is the number of words in a passphrase. The vertical axis is the size of the dictionary, or perhaps a more useful way to think about it, the rarest word in a password or passphrase that can be cracked. Because the logical attacker is going to use a list of words by frequency, the bigger that list is, the rarer the words are that are going to be in it. All of the numbers in the colored boxes are the amount of minutes required to complete an attack on the search space, a passphrase, and the coloration tells you how long that time is relative to minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, or years. Because I'm not going to lie, I don't know off the top of my head how many minutes are in a week. Going down or to the right exponentially increases the amount of work needed, but some jumps in the difficulty here are sharp, and this is where the idea of a computational wall comes in. Seemingly sudden increase in the difficulty that you can't go over. Because, of course, this is only a consumer GPU. What about a V100? Well, it's not actually that much different. There are reasons why V100 should be much better, but it's not a variable for this chart. Anyway, what if we have more than one GPU? Why not 8? Well, the chart's going to push down a little bit and open up some options. Those of you who have noticed the size of the numbers we're dealing with on the vertical axis probably already have some nightmares to take home, even if you're already home. And I'm going to make sure everyone else has them too. In the 2-word column, that is more than 16 million words in 20 minutes. Basically, every word actually in use from every language spoken by at least 1% of the world's population fits in here with some room to spare for a couple extra million common passwords. In the 3-words column, that's every non-obsolete word in the English language, and it's testable in a matter of hours. And in the 4-words column, we have a sizable chunk of commonly used words where a target attack, say from scraping the memos of websites or going after a target and their interests, makes sense. Now, before I get too excited, I'm sure someone here has been thinking, okay, cool, but that's NTLM. Well, what about a slower, actually kind of secure hash? Well, here's the same chart for SHA-512 Unix passphrases. You'll note there are still viable attacks in the 2- and 3-word passphrases. And here's bcrypt, or blowfish, configured with some slightly older Unix defaults, but nonetheless Unix defaults. Although we lose a lot of capability, we can still go after 2-word passphrases. As an attacker, this chart does make me sad, but the reality of most corporations using Windows is that there will be somewhere something using a hash like NTLM for quite a while to come. And as far as the average individual user is concerned, they need to have a passphrase that isn't going to get cracked when the hashes get dumped either inside their institution or when a website gets all of its passwords dumped by SQL injection. And let's be real, a large number of websites and companies keep on getting caught with their pants down, and we only find out they're using a fast hash or plain text the hard way. Not to mention the difficulty of computing a hash is a linear factor in a word where computing power increases exponentially. So if you're not using decrypt or blowfish, yeah, we're going back to the other chart. Because it's time to get to the attacker mindset and play a game of bad recommendations. And the first up is Google, which, yes, the advice is a little old here, but the advice, much like their policy, hasn't been updated in more than a decade. I love sandwiches isn't a great example, and that mix of leet speak and case shifting doesn't really do too much for the difficulty. I'll be generous and say that it makes it about 100 times harder. But in terms of the rarity, this slide shows where various words fall on Google's own most searched words, and the most frequently occurring words in English Wikipedia, the G number is the Google one, W is the Wikipedia word list. And the fact of the matter here is the underlying phrase is crackable in under 3 minutes. So even giving the benefit of the doubt and guessing leet speak substitutions, it's crackable in 244 minutes. I should also mention the recommendation put forth in the absolute latest NIST and FBI recommendation that I could find, which, well, they suggested voices protected 2020 we are, and then suggested a passphrase that is even better is director month learn truck, because the words are unrelated. Well, those words might seem unrelated, but they all have one thing in common, and that's they're eye-searingly common. The rarest word in here is truck, and oh boy, that's in the top 4,000 words regardless of which list you choose. 4 common words are not safe from offline cracking, which does bring up a perhaps more viral recommendation that's been on people's minds here. XKCD 936. Now, a lot of people have used this as password advice, including management at Intercontinental Exchange. And the matter of it is, the math in XKCD's advice is fine, because it was written to handle an online attack where the rate of guessing is only 1,000 a second. Now, there's a claim here that the average user shouldn't worry about attacks to crack a stolen hash, but I'm here to tell you from experience, the average user reuses passwords. The average user also works at a company, and if that company is larger than a couple dozen people, they should worry about stolen or dumped hashes, because either out of their infrastructure or from the websites that their users use professionally and personally, it will happen. 4 common words isn't safe from offline attacks. If anything, the XKCD example is a little stronger than intended, because staple isn't actually that common. It's number 11,367 on the Wikipedia frequency list and completely off the end of the Google list. And then there's the level of entropy XKCD says is a common word. And if we say common words are words that are in the first 2,048, then attackers can win all the way out to 6-word phrases. Yes, really 6. If you're a Diceware user using one of the small sheets, good luck, you're toast. There are some caveats, and the real world isn't as simple as an Excel sheet. So before we get into real world results and the mechanics of attacks, we should very quickly cover the things that are going to be ever present when attacking these passwords using a GPU. The first of which is the dictionaries and the size of the dictionaries. There's a lot of bandwidth to go around for operations within a GPU and its memory, but transferring data to the GPU, well, PCIe generation 3x16 is only 16 gigabytes max, and that's theoretical, not real world, and Gen 4 only doubles that. So this might seem like it's quite a bit, but 16 billion theoretical bytes per second. Modern GPUs can do 26 billion real hashes of passphrase per second. One of these numbers doesn't fit within the other, and it also is real, not theoretical. The other limitation to be mindful of is in terms of what kind of attacks are even possible and the nature of CUDA or the discrete cores actually inside of the GPU and what they can do, which is, well, not a lot. They were built to do lots of single instruction, multiple data computation on matrices, vectors, floating points for graphics, which means lots and lots of arithmetic logic units and not a lot of space or silicon devoted to controlling them. The nature of a single instruction mobile data means groups, or in this diagram, rows of ALUs, all need to be doing the same thing at the same time. And those instructions, a significant portion of the data need to fit in smaller shared cache. And oh, right, the instructions better be simple and something that I actually do and something that I actually implement in a Hashcat or John the Ripper. Maybe you just should use the things in Hashcat or John the Ripper is really what I'm saying here. It is your best bet to just find a workaround. Also, thank you Hashcat and John the Ripper devs for making it easy to use these devices for cracking. Okay, let's talk about techniques and results. First, dictionary attacks, basically checking through a massive list of passwords in a file with or without a GPU generating some additional candidates to check through rules. More on that later. Intercontinental Exchange, we've been actually doing dictionary attacks. And we've been doing dictionary attacks during that period Jerry mentioned in the soundbite where we rolled out the 15-character policy. And as you can see in this graph, the average length of a cracked password, the policy wasn't just successful, it caused rapid jumps in length as it started to be enforced. And after implementation, the average length kind of evened out despite some outlying spikes as a kind of close but not quite barely above the absolute minimum. Humans. And this is the graph that's much more interesting of the percentage of passwords that were cracked by the dictionary attacks over time. And yes, that number in the upper left is over 50%. Dictionary attacks are very good when you have a dictionary of passwords made under the same password policy targeted. And yes, dictionaries also aren't very good after the people change their password out for a significantly different or better policy and start picking things that aren't in the dictionary anymore. In fact, if we overlay the two graphs, we see multiple downward shifts in the number of cracked passwords, even after the average of the cracked passwords and the length of them is above 15 characters, as further enforcement for changing cracked passwords is rolled out until it settled somewhere around 1%. Mind you, didn't approach 0, it holds down around 1%, and there's always somebody picking and repicking a terrible password. These graphs are trimmed and don't show anything that's happened recently, but I assure you, the straight dictionary attacks have not had much success since. So let's talk about combinator attacks. Attacks centered around combining multiple dictionaries or the same dictionary onto itself. This attack is pretty straightforward, and we've already talked about it, so let's kind of get into the results. And well, here's a chart of every passphrase password longer than 15 characters ever cracked in Intercontinental Exchange. That was crackable with a small dictionary of words or common passwords, organized to reflect the chart from earlier in the computational wall part. And in order to do this, I had to modify an algorithm for the second passwords called ZXVBN to properly handle spaces, because apparently that's a thing that it can't do. Funny thing about passphrases, people actually use spaces quite frequently, and apparently the creators of ZXVBN didn't think that was important to handle. Anyway, I digress. Passphrase is slotted here based on how many elements, usually words, but sometimes a really common password like 123, ZXVBN believes it's made up of, and the rarity of the rarest element based on the number of guesses required, which should roughly dictate the size of the source dictionary you would need. We can see there is a rather precipitous drop-off, somewhere between 32,000 and 64,000, along with a pretty significant preference for 3-element passphrases, which might have something to do with the certain recommendations packaged with the policy. Now, this is neat and all, but what about the other data sets, say, not from this company? Well, I considered calling up various companies with a 15-character policy and seeing if they were willing to give me their password hashes. It seemed unlikely, though, so I kind of had to artificially make one. This is the results against over 37 million hashes from the How They've Been Pwned version 2 collection, where every password known to be less than 15 characters has been stripped out, which is only possible because over 90% of this list has already been cracked. Both of the attacks here are pretty shallow and short running, in large part because I only need to prove a point. And also the hash rate is artificially terrible, cross-checking 37 million hashes for matches, because the poor GPU that I have is very constrained. That being said, that is still 1.14% of all of the passphrases in the dataset in less than 3 minutes. Are you scared yet? Good. But here's an example of what happens using a lot more candidates and checking the combinations of passwords. If you still remember that third straw man argument, this is all of the RockU word list on top of itself. Sure, it takes a day and 16 hours on this poor GPU struggling with 37 million hashes chugging through its memory. But in reality, this would take about 16 minutes on a single machine in AWS or Google Cloud and would cost single-digit dollars. Now that I've got the would-be crackers excited, there are some technical shortfalls with Hashcat that need to be noted. The combination mode only takes 2 files as input, so you're going to want to use this so Hash can actually load as much on the GPU ahead of time, which means if we want to check something like a 3 or 4 word element, well, you're still stuck using a 2-element combination, and you need to make intermediate dictionaries, being mindful of the exponential file size. It's a similar deal for the hybrid mode, which can only take 1 word list and 1 mask file. You could use other programs and pipe in the candidates, but you pay the piper when doing so on a fast hash. You basically have to create all the candidates off of the GPU and then somehow shunt them over to the GPU, and you get restricted by PCIe bandwidth. The other thing Hashcat isn't going to help you with is generating variants of passphrase candidates with the spaces and capitalization that people normally use. You can convince it to do so, and you're going to want, from what I've seen, title case, sentence, all lowercase, both with and without spaces. And the easiest way to do this is with individual rules on a combinator attack, starting with the preprocessed dictionary that already has the spaces between capitalized words, and then you can manipulate it easily enough to get these spaces and capitalizations desired. J corresponds to the left word list, K corresponds to the right word list, which on the topic of rules, unfortunately, is another shortfall. You can only do 1 set of rules per word list in combination mode. Yes, sorry. If you want to check lots of different things using rules, like common words in between 2 words, you're going to need a honking massive bash file or a program to manage it for you. This is actually what Trusted Sex Hate Crack is doing behind the scenes for what they call middle or thorough combinator attacks. All right, head back out of the weeds. Enough about the conditions of combinators. Let's move on to Prince attacks, which, despite the other name for the attack, has nothing to do with the artist formerly known as Prince. It is a backronym for probability infinite chained elements. Its purpose is simple. Take the path of least resistance and find more passphrases sooner by outputting shorter length candidates first. Not only because the search space is smaller, but we expect to find more passphrases here because people tend to pick passphrases as close to the minimum amount of effort possible. This overlap of least resistant motivations is great for an attacker. How does Prince actually work? Well, it injects a word list, sorts all the contents by length and puts them into basically separate sublists, and then begins producing candidates at the minimum specified length out of the lists of various lengths, iterating through all the possible combinations of the lists until the options are exhausted, at which point it moves on to making longer candidates. Now, after that explanation of how Prince works, you might be wondering, why not just use combinators of length cut lists? I can kind of do this myself. I don't need a program for this. Aren't Prince and Hashcat separate programs when I have to pay the piper? Didn't you just mention how that was terrible for performance? Well, yes, you do have to pay the piper, and you could manually manage all of those attacks, but it gets really crazy to manage all of those lists and combinations for 3 and 4 element passphrases. It's doable, but you really need another program or script. And there is a solution that circumvents this, and it comes back to one of the undermining factors I mentioned earlier. It's, well, people like packing complexity on the ends. And this is from the Intercontinental Exchange passwords. These are the positions of dictionary elements in passphrases. Larger numbers mean more passphrases contain an element straight out of a dictionary, as in a word, in that position. And there's one heck of a disparity between that last position of the passphrase and the rest of the passphrase. Humans are packing complexity on the ends to the tune of 4 times as often. There's going to be a non-dictionary word on the end, or on the beginning or the end. It's really strange that nobody decides to put the numbers in the middle. In any case, this is the fix for Prince's terrible hash rate on fast hashes. You just use rules, basically, because when you use the default hashcat cracking mode, you can supply with a rules file that's of any length. There is a problem here. Most rule lists made by people on the internet long enough to make use of a GPU's spare resources are focused on modifying passwords, not really altering passphrases with suffixes or prefixes. So I handmade one. That's up on GitHub now with common prefixes and suffixes, your 2020, your exclamation point, etc. And I've also released a list of the 50,000 most common prefixes and suffixes based on running ZXCVBN on all the passphrases in the Have I Been Pwned version 2 dataset that are longer than 15 characters. Anyway, let's talk success rates for Prince. Now the kicker here is that we're making use of that rule that I mentioned earlier to catch passphrases with common suffixes and prefixes, so there's not going to be anything that's a single element in here. We can see a repeat of an earlier trend, namely that sudden drop-off between 32,000 to 64,000 of the dictionary size, and some clustering around 3 elements, including the suffix and prefix. Strangely enough, people seem fine with substituting out a word for an exclamation point, and this works pretty well for sussing out passphrases. On the much larger data set, we can also see the reason why people like using Prince attacks. Both of these attacks were done on the RockU password dictionary as a source, and they were stopped at the same time at 1/8 of the runtime of the RockU squared on that poor piddly GPU struggling under all those millions of hashes. But that complete attack I mentioned earlier took a day and 16 hours and got 5.82%. These Prince attacks managed to concentrate a significant portion of that success very early on in cracking. The other comparison here is the performance between restricting the number of elements Prince is allowed to use in an attack, and at least in this case, there was a limited but significant advantage to focusing on only 3 element passphrases, because we're also using that rule set mentioned earlier, trying the prefixes and suffixes on Prince candidates. I'll also say again, this was at a pretty abysmal hash rate because of the scenario that poor GPU is really struggling, and these attacks can be very, very quick if you're not trying to pipe 37 million hashes through a poor GPU with only a couple of gigs of RAM. And speaking of fast, it's about time I get to the new and shiny. Word level Markov chains for going after passphrases that are at their core phrases. What are word level Markov chains? Well, the simplest explanation that I can give is that it's an overglorified state model to store relationships between groups of words. For this example, we'll just do a 2-gram model, think 2 elements in a state. And if the phrase used for training is the cows eat grass, a 2-gram model will record state transitions, or in plain English, relationships between the cows to eat and cows eat to grass. Obviously, this isn't very terribly useful model by itself, but imagine if it had some more training data, say some hundreds, thousands, millions of sentences. The intent is to build up a model of the relationships between groups of words, and if we want to be more accurate, we can increase the number of elements in the state or raise the number gram of the model to 3, which in this case would be the relationship between the cows eat predicting the next word, grass. Now, there was one pre-existing proof of concept that I could find for this that actually would generate output fast enough to be useful in password cracking. Sadly, it was single-threaded, written in a mix of C# and C++, and designed with a Windows compile target in mind, and that wouldn't simply do for my purposes. So I created something similar in Python that is parallel, uses existing libraries, and is naturally more multi-platform. So how well does it do? Well, the astute members of the audience, when I showed this table on the right of every passphrase cracked that was Combinator findable, might have noticed that there were some numbers a little too far into the lower right based on the computational complexity charts we went through before. Let me color that chart for you. And now the very astute of you might also infer that I did not, in fact, have unlimited access to 8 V100s for all the testing here. And also this chart is very strangely positioned in the slide, almost as if it went further to the right. Well, it does. And I only had a single 2080 Ti for my research. I was also heavily time boxed, so everything here that isn't a shade of green, not from a Combinator attack. I can tell you that right now. Admittedly, not a deluge of results, but come on. Literal years with a Combinator attack would not have yielded some of these. And the couple out in the 6 and 7 element column, do you have any idea how long 10 to the 13 minutes is? Millennia. Certainly I'm very happy, but what about a much larger data set? And well, it's a similar story. These attacks are very quick when only doing a couple of words, but admittedly don't pull in too much. Only tens of thousands, whatever. Which may have something to do with the data set that we're actually playing with here. This was collected just broad spectrum from a bunch of internet sites. A lot of people are slowly moving towards passphrases. They aren't there yet. The other factor likely at play here is that there's just not going to be much out here. As soon as you start getting out to 4 words or more, nobody's requiring this. And I also would like to point out while we're here, there's an accuracy trade-off. For that n-gramness of the model that I mentioned earlier, if you choose a 3 gram over a 2 gram model, the 3 gram model is a little over half as much, but only took 1/12 the time. That is the accuracy trade-off. And if you were to actually make a very, very massive Markov model, being extremely accurate is going to be important. Now, before people get too uninterested, I really should show the impressive thing for me, which is what happens when you put this to use to get even longer passphrases, which you can totally do with a Markov model. And there still isn't much out here in the search space, but people seem content to use phrases at this length, probably because these should be safe according to everything that is sane and everyone's advice. And these aren't even really common phrases. They're just kind of phrases. Here's some examples of what isn't safe anymore. These probably aren't the phrases you expected to leave here knowing are crackable, and certainly not crackable in 1, 2, or 9 hours at speeds barely over 1 gigahash a second. Do you have nightmares yet? Because everything here was generated by a Markov model and a simple hashcat rule set. No dump passwords as input, no cherry picking shenanigans, all the training data was completely agnostic to the target passphrases. Admittedly, that agnosticism to targeting at all does produce some very strange candidates sometimes, and I've collected some of the weirder ones I've seen on the right here. I don't know how we went from intrauterine pressure catheters to kiwi or kiwis. I can only assume one of the websites scraped for the training data was a blog post about making kiwi or kiwis with an embedded catheter cowboy advertisement. I really don't know. Now, I should head off some common questions I'm anticipating. Some of you familiar with Hashcat might be thinking, doesn't Hashcat already have Markov chains? Why can't they just do this? Well, yes, it does. It has a pre-made model for character level predictions. When you start going out to 15 character passwords and what you want is multiple actual words, that model falls apart really quickly. Not to mention, it doesn't store relationships between words, and it will basically never finish because the search space is at least 333 sextillion combinations. Now, if you're thinking, why haven't you tried GPT-2 or some other machine learning algorithm? My answer is, have you considered hash rates? Markov chains are good for this because they're really quick. They're kind of the dumbest form of what somebody might call machine learning. And they're especially quick compared to the massive models like GPT-2, which by itself is more than 5 gigabytes and tends to take multiple seconds, even with GPU acceleration, to pop out a single prediction. We need models of predictions. We need millions of predictions per second for it to be viable in password cracking. And the other side of this is the more advanced models focus on making paragraphs or complete pages. We barely need sentences. There are very few passphrases I've seen that resemble more than a sentence fragment. All right, head back out of the weeds here. it's time to wrap up and summarize. If you're not an attacker, you've probably been sitting through this talk mildly terrified, waiting for some kind of recommendation. Allow me to make you wait slightly longer by addressing the red teamers first. Red teams, please don't cop out. 15-character passwords are hard, but they aren't that hard to crack. Based on my experience, even an organization with a 15-character requirement and active cracking of its users with dictionaries has as much as 20% of its passwords waiting to be cracked by these techniques. And believe me, when you're playing 1 in 5 odds, you're going to bag an admin or service account. Even against bcrypt, you should be at least doing combinators, prince attacks, Markov chains for the duration of your engagement. Don't pretend your results should approach 0. It should never be 0. And there will always be somebody who picks something like Hello Spring 2020 as their passphrase, and that number bumps up around 1% in the organization with, again, active cracking of its users. We've seen this. Trust me, I know. I don't understand. Blue team, your turn finally. Do the math that applies to your situation and do a little more than just gather people that scored highly on an SAT a decade or more ago in their conference room and whiteboard it. If intercepted or dump hashes or personal password reuse is a concern for you, and it almost always should be, feel free to take my math and represent it. Unless your organization is cracking its own passwords, you won't know what other people are using, and you should recommend the best behaviors and plan for the worst, which brings me to something that can serve as a starting point for what to pass along to end users. And I will preface, this is my personal recommendation, which is highly paranoid, but the intent here is to make sure that a hash can't be cracked in $500 of expense, regardless of the type of hash, which means making an illogical or unlikely phrase of 5 or more relatively uncommon words that are thematically unrelated. We're talking diabetic unicorn trap Chicago tunnel as a passphrase. Unless you force an attacker to use a large dictionary combining multiple types of words, cities, structures, fantasy creatures, verbs, medical conditions, and use some words that are uncommon, you're building your security posture with some cracks in the foundation. Any questions?
Awesome. That was awesome. This talk, if anything, has made me realize how little I know about password cracking, because
the rabbit hole always can go deeper. It can always go deeper.
Yeah. It always can go. Anything in information security can always go deeper. But I quite frankly, I didn't even know about Purple Rain or anything of those attacks. So I seriously have to start reading up on password cracking now. There was a question besides from all the Wilford Brimley memes and the Cathartic memes and stuff from the
they're in there somewhere, but
yeah, they're there. I'm just gonna pull them up. There was one by Captain Salty Cracker, which is very apt username for this talk. It sounds like using a password generator removes at least the predictable human tendencies. Would you say that's okay?
Yeah, but again, we come back to okay, well, now you're using a password generator, and if everybody's using the same one, well, I hope the underlying math actually does check out, not just Jerry levels of whiteboard checks out. Because if somebody figures out what you're using and your couple of source words are rapidly outstripped by rapidly advancing computational power in GPUs, you're up a creek. You're up a creek really quick. This kind of comes to Diceware was the oldest way of doing this, and there was a time once when you could make longer passwords out of a very short sheet of passwords to dig from, and all you'd have to do is just roll a couple of dice and completely take the human factor out of it. Yep. But that's been completely eclipsed for everything but there have been more recent lists, but the older lists have been completely outstripped by anything. And to the comments of password managers, please, yes, use a password manager. Admittedly, that does mean you're going to have some kind of means to get into the password manager. So there will always be generally at least one password.
Yeah.
And that's this one. This is the diabetic unicorn trapped in the Chicago tunnel. That is your one password, the one you don't forget, the one you don't rotate, because there's always going to be one, or it's going to be like the BIOS password to a computer. 2FA is not going to apply there, or it's going to be the Windows password because we can't get 2FA rolled out in the organization completely, or it's going to be the like in the Linux server sudo password up from the guest account, or the root password that, the break glass account. You're always going to have some place where you need it, because sadly passwords are super important when it comes, because they're ingrained in everything. We haven't moved away from it yet. There's no clear out. To the question of what's my favorite password manager, I won't say, with good reason, perhaps. Yeah. I use a couple. I've been forced to use a couple for work and also for personal, but I would go with ones that have been well vetted at the end. If it works, if it is storing stuff well, you shouldn't really have to worry about it too much.
Actually, I have a couple questions for you as well. So, like, I also noticed that when you do use a password manager, sometimes the default settings for generated passwords are actually pretty bad. Like, they're not a high level characters. Yeah, that's what I've noticed. Is that something you've run across as well? Because I know for a fact, like, I'm not going to call out specific vendors.
Yeah,
but
this is in the realm of my tongue is tied and under NDAs, but I have seen a fair number of very secure password generators, and I have contributed towards bringing down the use of a couple of them because the passwords they generated, as soon as we figured out what the magic was behind it, we set up a very, very narrow crack to go after them, and they were all toast in basically less than 20 minutes. And that was, nobody appreciated that, including the people trying to reset the system. So just make it secure. And if you know you've got something like that, don't let it fester in the organization or seep in the organization and stay there forever. There was a question for, given the human factor, what should we tell the C-suite?
That's a good question.
So I rag on Jerry in this presentation because it is entertaining to do so, and everybody can perhaps relate of making fun of your boss's boss's boss and the horror that should come with that. But at least in my case, at least one member of the C-suite, the CISO, genuinely does understand this, and although it needs some drilling and reiterating, you can basically just do exercises with them. I've had a couple of people who have heard and I've heard and have suggested basically sit in a room with them, ask them to make a password that's as strong as what they would normally use, and then take it, and along with all the rest of the C-suites, and then with your red team or whoever your subject matter expert is for password cracking, basically just put with a highlighter the boxes around each, like, okay, well, here's one word, here's two words, and there's a number. I don't need very much for this. Also, ZXCBN has an online web forum, which people are not going to be terribly inclined to put their actual password in, but if you put in something that's kind of like what you would normally put in terms of complexity, it does a pretty good job, except for the spaces problem that I mentioned. They still haven't gotten around that one. So if you put in a passphrase without any spaces in it, then it's fine, and we'll give you an actual reasonable estimate of how long it would take to crack. And it's very good. It's basing it off of pretty reasonable math, and it's kind of conservative in that thing.
Awesome. And I think another person asked, what is an affordable cracking rig that you'd recommend?
What is an affordable cracking rig? A 2080 Ti? No. Go on eBay, find whatever the crypto bros are getting rid of at that particular moment. Now is probably a bad time, unfortunately, because a bunch of people are doing weird things with GPUs because the 3080s dropped and the 3090s are soon to come. But every time there's a crash in the crypto market, it's really easy to grab something off of eBay, and as long as you find a case where the seller has good ratings and there's some good return terms, you're fine. Pick up like a 1080 Ti. I have in my personal machine a 1080 Ti. The work computer that I was messing around with had the 2080. I wish I had a 2080 at home. I don't. Soon.
That's actually that's actually good advice.
Grab something like that, and then I mean, there's been a ton of your Linus Tech Tips, your other YouTube tech video channels. Well, the thing for making a gaming rig is basically the thing for making a cracking rig. You can do it for under $500. You just need a good GPU because most of the stuff's getting done on the GPU.
That's actually a good tip. I never thought of that. I'm gonna try doing that actually for myself because I'm trying to set up a better lab environment. So might as well do that as well.
I will say, if you're putting a ton of cards in a machine, get the blower style, the one with a single fan that tries to exhaust out the back. They look terrible. Their benchmarks are bad for games because they can't ramp up as high. But when you're going to be running a cracking job for 24 hours, you want the stuff exhausting out of the case, not into each other in a like 4 GPU configuration.
And it just melts.
Also, yes, for Jeff Manjunkin, any tutorial for a mining rig, usually pretty good cracking rigs, although you do have to worry a little bit about PCI bandwidth because some of those are like trying to do splitter out and have only like 1 or 2 PCIe lanes to each card. And then if you try to copy any dictionary in those cards, it's just not going to take it at any reasonable speed.
And I think someone also brought up this question, using non-ASCII characters is good to enhance security, which I'm pretty sure you'd agree with that.
I would generally agree with that, yep. Though I would caveat that with if the characters you're picking are just part of foreign language words, because ASCII is very English-based. I think as more and more people start including certain emojis in their passwords, which also still breaks a ton of things, which is really unfortunate. Please check yourself before you wreck yourself and make sure you can recover it if you try to use that as a password and whatever site you're using does not accept UTF-8, 16, 32, whatever you're actually pulling it from. But I think there's going to be techniques that pull up because, believe it or not, a lot of people use kind of just the same emojis over and over again. Not a lot of people using the Japanese turn left sign emoji.
That's a good point, yeah. And actually, one more question for me. Do you have any, so my problem with a lot of word lists is that they're mostly English words, right? Do you have any,
yes.
Do you have any like repositories that people put together for localization specific word lists?
There's a couple to go to. The one that comes to mind immediately is SecLists, which I know has a bunch of foreign language ones dragged in it. And it's kind of hard to find it because there's so much in the SecLists GitHub repo. But you can drill down, and if you just go basically Google searching, you don't really have to worry too much about contracting a virus from a text file. Usually.
Yeah, that's pretty safe bet.
You'd really have to try, I think, for that. But there are, if you just basically search for French language dictionary or something else of that line, some of these attacks, especially when you're doing like the 3-word and 2-word attacks, you can basically throw an entire language dictionary at it within reason and be okay, as long as it's the most commonly used. It's not like the extended dictionary with all the Shakespearean words or the Middle Age words that are no longer in use anymore. You're usually pretty all right, but I would recommend, and I'm not going to share an Excel document with macros on it for everybody to download, but I would recommend doing the math real quick before you throw it on the GPU to figure out how long that's probably going to take. And it's not too hard of math, really. As soon as you figure out what your hash rate is, you get really close to your hash rate if using Hashkit's Combinator tech. They did a fantastic job of implementing that, despite it being limited to only 2 elements, which is, anyway.
Yeah. And also another thing, so I've been working with AWS services a lot more, and I don't know if you, so there's this thing called AWS Comprehend, which essentially you give it like some text and it'll grab out the keywords of that text and do like some machine learning on the text. I was interested in if you've played in that with that, because I think it would be an interesting. Yeah, it would. I think it would be.
Not. I do think there is a lot of messing around that you can do with the machine learning and some other stuff on top. And I want to answer this one because I just saw it come up with the dictionary. And yeah, Jeff Manjunkin is properly one-plussing it for a reason. Solutions to blacklist the top common passwords with known bad passwords. So there's a couple of ways. If you're on a website, Have I Been Pwned is actually hosting a service where you can basically submit a hash of whatever your users are trying to set, and it will tell you whether or not it's in their list. As far as like inside a domain, you probably shouldn't be submitting all of the hashes of all of your passwords out to some internet entity. When and where possible, you can also check that locally. There's lists to download. The Have I Been Pwned list is at a major extent. If you're within a corporate domain, maybe start talking to your upper level or just IT management figures to see if cracking your own organization is a thing that you can do under the guise of, if we can crack it, somebody else externally definitely can. And you don't really need to do too much for setting that up. And that way you can just download any dictionary, and as long as you have the hashes, you can go at it. And I have heard of people doing solutions where the domain controller itself basically has another machine just attached to it that it occasionally yumps files off of, and that thing goes along and starts trying to crack things, and the only thing it does is spit out usernames of people with crackable passwords. And I can't obviously I'm not going to go into, for the sake of sanity, more than our CISO already did with giving intel about our cracking setup, but we are basically, you have to have the hashes. One machine has the hashes, it does the cracking, and then we spit out from there the accounts that need to be reset.
Awesome. Well, Travis, that was awesome. That was an amazing talk. I'm gonna have to go over your slides and just read up on everything.
It is fast. I do apologize for how much I try to cram.
Oh no, it's fine.
But
fine. It was a fire hose, and we all like fire hoses.